Did you know that Boot Hill is Honkai Star Rail's first Native American character? That's right, the moonwalking cyborg cowboy intergalactic bounty hunter is actually directly based on real American history. And in this video I'll be exploring some of the events and people that influence his backstory and design. First, let me recap Boot Hill's lore. He hails from a planet named Aragon Efarsha. His real name and real parents are unknown. As a child, he was found crying in the snow by two cowboys, Gray and Nick, who raised him along with other adoptive children. Young Boot Hill was raised in a real Wild West. Gray taught him about the planet's nature, its land, plants, and animals, whilst Nick taught him how to ride horses and herd cattle. Boot Hill followed in their footsteps, becoming a cowboy of his own. His day-to-day was fighting bandits, hunting dangerous beasts, and securing trade deals across the planet. He lived life on the edge on the vast plains of his home until one day, just like his parents many years ago, he found a crying baby, a red-faced girl whom he brought home like Gray and Nick had done with him. It was a perfect world, an undisturbed frontier with clean air and clear skies. Everything changed, however, when the IPC showed up. The International Peace Corporation, the massive galactic mega company linking the entire known universe's economy, showed up to Aragon Efarsha with a massive spaceship that blotted out the moon. They had one goal, which was to harvest the planet's resources, especially its precious black ore. IPC troops poured into the planet, ravaging the land and attacking the cowboys, who tried to resist as best as they could, but found themselves technologically outmatched. Boot Hill was witnessing his entire world crumble around him and hatched a plan. He stole an IPC uniform and snuck onto the spaceship to figure out who was responsible for this attack. He quietly took out every IPC guard until he reached the main cabin, where he heard chilling words from the leader of the invasion force. The Marketing Development Department had just authorized military force to, and I quote, bring civilization to this world. In despair, Boot Hill rushed out of the ship past laughing and joking IPC employees, fearing the worst for his family. He witnessed the IPC's orbital bombardment of the planet with the goal of eradicating any resistance by the cowboys. He arrived at his home to find everything and everyone reduced to ashes. Not even a body to bury was left behind, neither of his parents, his friends, nor his daughter. In the aftermath of the IPC's conquest, the surviving natives, mainly the old and young, only lived in reservations that were continuously shrinking in size. The IPC continued mining the planet's black ore, as it turns out, for the same kinds of weapons it had used to destroy it. Boot Hill himself left Aragon Efarsha, mentally and physically scarred by the destruction of his home and family. His experience as a cowboy led him to becoming a galaxy ranger, hunting down bandits on a cosmic scale, and he eventually found his way to an unnamed robotic doctor. He demanded cybernetic implants to be turned into a living weapon, threatening the doctor, who reluctantly performed the operation that would have been fatal to most people. Boot Hill survived, and informed the doctor that he'd been dead for a long time. This is the moment he took the name Boot Hill. He realized that no one would ever again call him the name Gray and Nick had given him, and his old self was gone. He emerged from that lab with one goal: to figure out the man who ordered his planet's destruction and enact revenge. He returned to Aragon Efarsha for a lead on his quest, but found that the IPC had already purged all records of the invasion, as well as the executives' involvement in it. He then barged into a local branch of the Garden of Recollection, looking for any memories related to his home. His rampage in the garden made the memory bowls fall over, distracting the memo keepers as he searched for the right one. He was eventually kicked out, but not before finding out the identity of his people's killer, Oswaldo Schneider, the director of the Marketing Development Department. This is when Boot Hill's hunt truly began. He made his name on the IPC's most wanted list for attacks on the corporation's fleets and workers. This was partly just to get intel, but also to goad the IPC and send a clear message to Oswaldo. It was only a matter of time before he'd get his revenge. That brings us up to speed with the Boot Hill we're familiar with in-game. Now, jumping into the real history behind Boot Hill's lore, let's start with his home planet's name, Aragon Efarsha. It might not ring a bell in English, but remember this is a localization of the Chinese game text. Taking a look at the Chinese text, you get these two words. If you look them up, it translates to Algonquin Apache, two of the largest real-world indigenous American language families. The Algonquin tribes are present from the eastern seaboard to the Great Plains, whilst the Apache are located mainly in the American Southwest. They both had a gigantic presence in North America, which explains the decision to name Boot Hill's home planet after them. The fate of his planet is meant as a parallel to the conquest and colonization of the continent by European and North American settlers. In both cases, an isolated, resource-rich world is initially populated by countless tribes who lived off the land, on a massive expanse of pristine nature that they did fight over, but that remained unindustrialized and venerated. They are suddenly invaded by a technologically advanced power from beyond the skies or the sea, who's after their homeland's untapped resources. In our world, this wasn't a sudden process like in HSR. It began more than 5 centuries ago and had no definitive end. Because of this, there are countless events that resemble what happened to Boot Hill's world. Various peoples ended up either permanently and forcefully relocated or outright killed to the point of extinction. The first outcome meant a permanent loss of a homeland, a loss of prosperity, and worse odds of survival overall. One notable real-world example was the Trail of Tears, when in 1830 the United States government passed the Indian Removal Act. This called for the expulsion of Native Americans from the eastern United States to west of the Mississippi River. Homes were burned and people were murdered by settlers and American soldiers as entire tribes were made to march at gunpoint off their lands westwards through wilderness, mud, rain, and snow, before ending up in new territories that were alien to them. Their entire lives had been uprooted at a whim so that a foreign force could exploit their lands. In the same vein, the young and old of Boot Hill's planet would have went from a lifestyle of hunting and herding on seemingly endless tracts of land to instead having to make do in whatever way they could on their small reservations, knowing that the future of their people was uncertain. The second outcome is outright genocide. Some tribes became the direct target of extermination by colonial forces. In these cases, colonial settlers never intended for the survival of the tribes that were in their way. They justified their actions as the inevitable triumph of a stronger so-called civilized force over an uncivilized one. One of the biggest motivations for genocide was to acquire the resources on the tribe's land. This is exactly what happened in California during its gold rush. In 1847, the United States conquered California from Mexico, and a year later, massive deposits of gold were found in the north-central part of the state. The news spread like wildfire, and tens of thousands of settlers from across America and elsewhere in the world rushed to the region, hoping to make their fortune. Almost immediately, these settlers armed themselves to attack and kill Native Americans to set up mines on their land. It was clear as day, and even state policy. The first governor of California, Peter Burnett, openly said that the war of extermination that will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct was to be expected. Over 40 native peoples in California saw their populations plummet drastically because of these policies. The Yuki, whose lands were extremely gold-rich, lost 95% of their population in the 19th century, going from 2,000 in 1770 to only 100 by 1910. Like Boot Hill's people, this tiny remaining population was ushered into reservations to free up the land for settlers. Another tribe, the Yahi, was completely wiped out. They were designated wild Indians, forced into hiding into the wilderness because they were otherwise killed on sight. The last Yahi died in 1916, only 5 years after he emerged from the mountains starving and alone. Let's compare this to the IPC's plan for Aragon and Farso. They discover the planet, find out that it's rich in a valuable black metal ore, and then justify the conquest as, in Oswaldo Schneider's own words, bringing civilization to the planet by bombarding it. They destroyed an entire culture of people that they deemed primitive so that they could appropriate the land for themselves. It is a one-to-one reference to events like the California Gold Rush, and it really puts into perspective just how much Boot Hill's hate for the IPC and the Marketing Development Department is justified. Boot Hill's Native American inspiration is of course also combined with a Wild West cowboy theme. There are so many Western references in his design. Several of his lines are direct quotes from Clint Eastwood movies.
The heart, Ramon. Don't forget the heart.
Remember to aim for the heart.
When you have to shoot, don't talk.
Remember this. When it's time to shoot, quit yapping.
See, in this world, there's two kinds of people, my friend. Those with loaded guns, and those who dig.
There are only two kinds of people in the world. Those with a loaded gun, and those who dig their own grave.
A huge aspect of the Wild West as a thematic is how it intersects with Native American culture. The settlers, gunslingers, and ranchers that we associate with the frontier were, after all, moving through lands that had been lived on by indigenous people for a long time. Some were native themselves. They lived between the two worlds of an encroaching modern power and their traditional lifestyles. This duality is also true for our own cyborg cowboy, and no place is it more obvious than his name. The first thing we learned about him back when his strip marking dropped out of nowhere without anyone knowing who he was. Let's start with the Wild West reference in Boot Hill's name, which he tells us himself.
If few thousand years back, folks called those deadly gunslingers Boot Hills. You see, it ain't exactly a name meant for the living, and, well, I guess I ain't quite what you call alive.
Real-life boot hills or graveyards are set up in newly established frontier towns in the Wild West. These towns didn't yet have the people or the means to have elaborate cemeteries or funeral homes yet, and often the types of people buried in them were the early casualties on the frontier, which is to say gunslingers, outlaws, sheriffs, and bandits. A lot of those buried in boot hills were also people that were destitute and had no next of kin. Because of this, they were buried with all of their possessions, including their boots. As the Wild West came to an end and these towns grew into bigger cities with proper graveyards, boot hills and their denizens were slowly forgotten, bygones of an earlier time. Boot Hill's name makes perfect sense in this context. He sees himself as a dead man walking, a relic of a doomed planet who's got nearly nothing left of his past, but will die to settle the score. The native half of his name has to do with that second part, Boot Hill's new identity and his new quest for vengeance. First, let me backtrack to one of the real-world events I talked about previously, the California Genocide. I mentioned the Yahi people as one of those tribes that were completely killed by settlers. Because they had been designated as wild Indians, they were murdered on sight and hid in the wilderness. Their numbers slowly dwindled until one last survivor was left. He emerged from the mountains starving and alone, and was the first and only Yahi known to the outside world because of the genocide. He spent his few remaining years in Western society as the only representative of his people. His name was Ishi, simply meaning man in the Yahi language. Like Boot Hill, this was not his real original name. He was given this name by the anthropologist Alfred Kroeber, because in the Yahi culture, you couldn't speak your own name unless someone else introduced you first. In Ishi's own words, he had no name, since his entire tribe was now gone. The parallels between Ishi and Boot Hill are tragic and astounding. Boot Hill also took on a new name once asked by the cyborg doctor, choosing to give up his old one, because any meaning behind it would be lost to the foreigners of the galaxy. No matter which strange new worlds in the stars he ends up on, there'll never be anyone else from Aragon and Farshel to greet him as kin. Boot Hill and Ishi both lost their communities, and are now forced into being their sole representatives. However they live will be how the world remembers their people. Ishi's name reflects that he's now the singular Yahi man left for the outside world to know his people by, and he spent his last years being studied in California universities. Boot Hill's name represents one last breath of life from his people, one last reckless effort from beyond the grave, throwing everything to the wind, including his own humanity, to get even with the ones that wronged him. When Boot Hill eventually gets his revenge on Oswaldo Schneider, his struggle will be immortalized as his people's own. That's all from me. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, if I missed anything or whatever else you have to say. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe because I have more content like this in store for Honkai Style. Alright, take it easy and until next time.